Your wife gave birth. She's in the ICU. Can you come to the hospital? I received a strange call and went, but my wife died 5 years ago. Look, I'm not saying I'm a coffee snob, but when you're on your third cup before noon and it tastes like someone dissolved a tire in hot water and called it an artisan blend, you start questioning your life choices. That's where I was at. Physically present in the break room at Henderson and Associates, spiritually somewhere between giving up and giving even less of a damn. The fluorescent lights above me hummed like they were judging my existence, which, honestly, fair. I was wearing the same pants I'd worn Monday. My shirt had a mystery stain that could have been ketchup or evidence of a crime scene, and I was pretty sure my breath could strip paint off walls. It was Tuesday. Just another soul-crushing, mind-numbing, why did I major in marketing Tuesday? My phone sat next to my keyboard like a loaded gun, silent and ominous. I should have known better than to assume the universe would let me finish my coffee in peace. The thing about tragedy is that it doesn't announce itself with trumpets and a red carpet. It shows up like an ex at a party, uninvited and ready to ruin your whole vibe. When that phone rang, the screen lighting up with Northwestern Medical Center, I remember thinking it was probably a scam. You know the type. "Hello, sir. We've been trying to reach you about your car's extended warranty. Also, you're dying. Please send Bitcoin." I almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. But something in my gut, that primal instinct that keeps humans from eating poisonous berries and trusting politicians, made me pick up. Mr. Evans, the voice on the other end, was female, professional, and had that particular tone that nurses use when they're about to deliver news that'll make you reconsider your religious beliefs. She sounded like she was reading from a script, like she'd made this exact call 17 times already today, and I was just another checkbox on her list of people whose lives were about to implode. "Your wife just gave birth. She's in the ICU. You should come now." I froze. My coffee cup hovered halfway between the table and my mouth, suspended in the kind of moment where time doesn't exactly stop, but it definitely starts walking really, really slowly. My brain did that thing where it tries to process information that doesn't compute, like trying to run Windows 95 on a quantum computer. It just kept buffering. Wife, birth, ICU. Those 3 words strung together like some kind of cosmic prank, a mad lib from hell. I almost spat the coffee all over my desk, and knowing my luck, it would have landed directly on the quarterly reports I'd been pretending to work on for the past week. What now? I managed to choke out, and I'm not proud of how my voice cracked like I was going through puberty again. Smooth, Evans, real smooth. The nurse, bless her heart or curse her efficiency, didn't miss a beat. She repeated the information like she was telling me my pizza delivery was running late. Not that my deceased spouse had apparently moonlighted as a maternity ward patient. Completely professional, completely unaware that she had just called the ghost department, the paranormal activity hotline, the Twilight Zone customer service center. "My wife's dead," I said flatly, and hearing those words come out of my mouth felt like swallowing glass. Even after 5 years, saying it out loud never got easier. It was a fact I'd accepted, grieved, and built a whole new miserable existence around. Sarah had died in a car crash, twisted metal, shattered glass, the kind of tragedy that makes the evening news and ruins dinner conversations. I'd identified the body. I'd picked out a casket that cost more than my first car. I'd stood at her funeral while people I barely knew told me she was in a better place and watching over me, which, if you ask me, sounds less like comfort and more like she got stuck with the worst surveillance job in the afterlife. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a pause so pregnant it could have been in the ICU itself. I could practically hear the nurse's brain trying to reboot, searching for the chapter in her training manual titled, "What to Do When the Husband Says the Patient is Dead, but She's Definitely Not."
"Well, congratulations anyway, sir," she finally said, and I swear I could hear the confusion wrapped in forced politeness. "She's in critical condition." Click. The line went dead just like that. No explanation, no "sorry for the confusion," no "perhaps you'd like to speak with our psychiatry department." Just a dial tone that sounded like the universe laughing at me. I sat there staring at my phone, like it had just delivered a prophecy, cursed me in ancient Greek, or told me I'd won the lottery in hell. My coworkers in the break room, Janet from accounting with her sad desk salad, Mike from IT with his comic book lunch bag, and Teresa the receptionist, who always smelled like lavender and broken dreams, they all froze mid-chew, mid-sip, mid-whatever mundane thing they were doing. You could have heard a pin drop, or, in this case, you could have heard my sanity cracking like a glow stick at a rave. "Either heaven's running a maternity ward now," I muttered, loud enough for them to hear, but quiet enough to maintain the illusion that I wasn't completely losing it, or someone's got serious explaining to do. Janet's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Mike's energy drink paused at his lips like he'd been hit with a freeze ray. Teresa just blinked at me with those wide eyes that said she was already mentally composing the email to HR about the guy in marketing having a breakdown in the break room.
Nobody said anything. What could they say? Hope your ghost wife feels better? Congrats on the zombie baby? There's no Hallmark card for this situation. No supportive emoji that captures your dead spouse just gave birth and you might be in a psychological thriller. I stood up, my chair scraping against the linoleum floor with a sound that felt way too dramatic for a Tuesday morning. My coffee sat there, still steaming, still tasting like existential crisis in liquid form. I grabbed my jacket, the one with the broken zipper I kept meaning to fix but never did, because apparently I was too busy preparing for supernatural emergencies, and headed for the door. My keys jingled in my pocket like tiny bells announcing the arrival of chaos. Behind me, I could feel my coworkers' stares burning holes in my back, their silent questions hanging in the air, thicker than the smell of microwaved fish that someone had nuked in there last week. As I walked through the office toward the elevator, passing cubicles full of people pretending to work while actually online shopping and scrolling through social media, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into a trap. Not the kind with ropes and tigers, but the kind that life sets up when it decides you've been too comfortable lately. When the universe looks at your boring existence and thinks, you know what would be hilarious? But here's the thing about traps. You can see them coming and still walk right into them. Because sometimes, even when your brain is screaming that this is a terrible idea, that you should call the police or a priest, or maybe just get really drunk and pretend this never happened, your legs keep moving forward. Anyway, the elevator doors opened with that familiar ding, and I stepped inside, watching my reflection in the brushed metal doors as they closed. I looked like a man who'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes, which tracked because that's pretty much how I felt. My finger hovered over the lobby button, and for just a second I considered pressing the button for the roof instead. Not for anything dramatic, I'm not that guy. But because maybe up there, with the wind and the sky and the pigeons who judged me less than my coworkers, I could think clearly, figure out if I was having a mental breakdown or if reality had just decided to rewrite the rules without consulting me first. But I pressed L for lobby, because apparently I'm the kind of guy who drives toward haunted hospitals instead of running screaming in the opposite direction. The elevator descended. My stomach dropped, and somewhere in the back of my mind, a little voice that sounded suspiciously like my dead wife whispered, "You're not ready for this." And you know what? That voice was absolutely right. I got in my car anyway, because apparently when life hands you a supernatural crisis, the appropriate response is to buckle up and drive straight into it like you're headed to pick up dry cleaning.
My Honda Civic, a 2015 model with a dent on the passenger side from when I backed into a shopping cart like an idiot, a check engine light that's been on since the Obama administration, and seats that smelled like old French fries and regret, sat in the parking garage looking about as enthusiastic about this journey as I felt, which is to say, not at all. But there I was, sliding behind the wheel, adjusting the rearview mirror that never stayed in place, and turning the key in the ignition while my hands shook like I'd mainlined espresso straight into my veins.
The rational part of my brain, the part that paid taxes on time and remembered to floss occasionally, was screaming at me to turn around, call the police, maybe check myself into the nearest psychiatric facility for a wellness check. Because, let's be real here, normal people don't get phone calls from hospitals claiming their dead wives just gave birth. Normal people don't nod along and think, yeah, sure, let me just drive over there and sort this out. Normal people call lawyers or priests or those ghost hunter guys from cable TV who always find evidence in the form of creaky floorboards and their own heavy breathing. But I guess I'd stopped being normal about 5 years ago. Right around the time I had to pick out what my wife would wear for eternity and pretend that mattered. 5 years. 5 long, brutal, soul-crushing years since Sarah, my wife, my partner, the woman who used to steal my hoodies and leave passive-aggressive notes on the fridge about whose turn it was to buy milk, died in a crash. Not just any crash, but the kind that makes the news. The kind where they use words like catastrophic and no survivors and make you fill out so much paperwork you start wondering if hell is just an eternal DMV. I'd identified her body, or what was left of it, in a room so cold and sterile it felt like they were storing meat, which I guess they kinda were. I'd buried her on a Thursday because apparently death doesn't care about your schedule. I'd mourned her through an entire winter where every day felt like wading through concrete. And I'd survived, barely. Enough casseroles from sympathetic neighbors to last a lifetime, each one delivered with sad eyes and the phrase, "Let me know if you need anything," which we all know is code for, "I'm glad this isn't happening to me." Mrs. Henderson from next door had brought me tuna casserole. Tuna? Who does that? That's not comfort food. That's a war crime in a glass dish. Then there was Bob from across the street with his famous green bean surprise, which was surprising only in how it managed to taste like absolutely nothing and everything wrong simultaneously. My cousin Diane had shown up with something she called grief lasagna, which I'm pretty sure was just regular lasagna, but she felt the need to theme it. For months, my freezer looked like a casserole graveyard, a monument to other people's discomfort with my tragedy. I'd eaten them all anyway, standing over the sink at 2 a.m. because cooking for one felt like admitting she was really gone. But now, apparently, someone, claiming to be her, had just gave birth, past tense, to a whole human baby, which meant that either I was losing my mind in the most creative way possible, or someone out there had a lot of explaining to do and possibly a very good lawyer on speed dial. I pulled out of the parking garage, squinting against the afternoon sun that seemed way too cheerful for the existential nightmare I was driving into. The radio was playing some pop song about love and summer and good vibes, which felt like the universe was deliberately mocking me. I punched it off so hard I nearly broke the button. Traffic on I-94 was, of course, a complete nightmare, because Chicago traffic doesn't care if you're having a personal crisis. There were minivans full of screaming kids, BMWs with drivers who thought turn signals were optional, and at least 3 cars with those stick-figure family decals that made me want to ram into them just on principle. I was stuck behind a truck hauling furniture, going approximately 5 miles per hour, and every second felt like an eternity. My mind started doing what it does best when left unsupervised, spiraling into increasingly ridiculous scenarios.
Halfway to the hospital, gridlocked between an Uber that smelled like someone had died in it and a Tesla with a vanity plate that said crypto, I started bargaining with the universe out loud like a lunatic. "Okay, listen up, Cosmos," I said to my windshield, which had a crack spreading across it like a spider web. "If this is some twisted prank, if this is hidden cameras or some elaborate scam, I'm egging someone's car. Not just any car. I'm talking a dozen eggs, maybe 2, the expensive, free-range organic ones. I'll throw in some toilet paper for good measure. I'll make it look like Halloween and a grocery store had a baby." A guy in the lane next to me glanced over and quickly looked away, probably adding, talking to himself in traffic, to his list of red flags for the day. The traffic light ahead turned red for the 15th time, and I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. What if it really was her? What if Sarah had somehow survived, faked her death, and spent 5 years doing what? Living a secret life? Running from something? Starting over with a new identity like she was in witness protection? And if it was her, why? Why would she let me think she was dead? Why would she put me through the worst years of my life? Make me sit through a funeral where I had to watch them lower her casket into the ground? Make me learn how to sleep alone in a bed that felt too big? Make me figure out how to exist in a world where she wasn't? Or maybe, and this seemed increasingly likely given my luck, it wasn't her at all. Maybe it was someone who looked like her, some cosmic coincidence, a glitch in the matrix. Maybe I was about to walk into that hospital and come face to face with a stranger who just happened to have the same face as my dead wife, and I'd have to explain to hospital security why I was having a meltdown in the ICU. "Sorry, officer, I thought she was my deceased spouse. My bad. I'll just see myself out and directly into therapy." By the time I pulled into Northwestern Medical's parking structure, a concrete monstrosity that charged $15 for the privilege of parking in a space designed for toy cars, I was sweating like I'd run a marathon in a sauna wearing a parka. My shirt was sticking to my back, my hands were clammy, and I'm pretty sure I'd stress-eaten all the mints in my glove compartment without realizing it. The parking garage smelled like exhaust and desperation, which felt appropriate. I circled the floors like a shark looking for prey, passing soccer moms in SUVs, medical residents in beat-up Hondas, and one guy in a Porsche who was definitely compensating for something. Finally, I found a spot on the 4th floor, wedged between a minivan with a baby on board sticker and a pickup truck that was definitely violating some parking regulations. I sat there for a moment, engine off, hands still gripping the wheel, staring at the concrete wall in front of me like it held the answers to the universe. It didn't. It just had some graffiti that said, "Jake was here," and a suspicious stain that I didn't want to think about. "Okay, Evans," I said to myself, because apparently I'd become the kind of person who gives themselves pep talks in parking garages. "You've got 2 options here. Option 1, you turn around, drive home, pour yourself a very large drink, and pretend this never happened. Option 2, you go in there and face whatever fresh hell is waiting for you behind that glass door." I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I looked terrible. Bags under my eyes, hair sticking up like I'd been electrocuted, and an expression that said I'd given up on life somewhere around 2020. Option 2 it is, you absolute idiot. I got out of the car, locked it twice because paranoia is a lifestyle, and headed toward the elevator. My footsteps echoed in the empty garage, each step feeling heavier than the last. The elevator doors opened with a ding that sounded way too cheerful, revealing a small metal box covered in hand sanitizer dispensers and signs about flu season. I stepped inside, pressed the button for the main floor, and watched the doors close, sealing me in with my terrible decisions. Because, let's be honest here, if my dead wife was somehow in the ICU giving birth, I didn't need a parking ticket or a therapist or even a stiff drink. I needed a priest, an exorcist, maybe one of those psychics who charge $200 an hour to tell you what you want to hear. I needed answers that made sense in a world that had stopped making sense the moment my phone rang in that break room. The elevator descended. My stomach dropped along with it. And I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to walk into something that would either explain everything or shatter what little remained of my sanity. The doors opened to the main lobby. All white walls and hand sanitizer smell, and people in scrubs looking exhausted. I stepped out, took a deep breath that tasted like recycled air and medical-grade anxiety, and headed toward the front desk. Whatever was waiting for me up in that ICU, ghost, doppelganger, or bureaucratic nightmare, I was about to find out. And knowing my luck, it would probably be all three. At the front desk, a nurse named Tina blinked at me like I'd just materialized out of thin air, which, given the circumstances, felt weirdly appropriate. Her name tag was slightly crooked, pinned to scrubs covered in cartoon stethoscopes that were probably meant to make sick people feel better, but just made me feel like I was in a children's hospital designed by someone who'd given up on subtlety. She had that look, the one where service industry professionals master the art of looking simultaneously helpful and dead inside. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail so tight it could have been classified as a facelift, and she had a coffee stain on her sleeve that told me she was having just as great a day as I was. "Are you Mr. Evans?" she asked, glancing down at a clipboard that looked like it had seen better days, probably better years if we're being honest. Her voice had that practiced customer service tone that people use when they're required to be polite but would rather be literally anywhere else. I respected it. We were kindred spirits in our mutual desire to not be having this conversation. "Depends," I said, leaning against the counter because my legs had apparently decided they were done holding me up. "Am I about to meet a zombie or a lawsuit?" I tried for humor because that's what I do when I'm terrified. Make inappropriate jokes that make people uncomfortable. It's a gift, really. A terrible, socially unacceptable gift that's gotten me in trouble at every funeral I've ever attended. She squinted at me, her eyes doing that thing where they try to figure out if you're joking or having a mental breakdown. In my case, it was definitely both. She clicked her pen, one of those cheap hospital pens that never works right and probably cost taxpayers $7 each, and consulted her paperwork like it was the Dead Sea Scrolls. "Your wife just delivered a baby girl. Complications, but stable." She said it so matter-of-factly, like she was telling me my prescription was ready or my table at Olive Garden was available. No drama, no acknowledgement that what she just said violated every law of physics and human decency. "My wife's dead," I said flatly, and the words hung in the air between us like an accusation. The hospital lobby continued its usual chaos. People checking in, checking out, looking miserable in waiting room chairs that were specifically designed to be uncomfortable. An old guy was arguing with the vending machine, a kid was crying while his mom tried to convince him that shots weren't that bad, which was a lie, and everyone knew it. Life just kept going, completely indifferent to the fact that my reality was currently doing backflips. Tina smiled politely. The kind of smile that people give you when you've just said something that doesn't compute, but they're too professional to call you out on it. It was the smile of someone who'd seen everything in this job. People high on painkillers, families fighting over medical decisions, patients trying to escape in hospital gowns, and had decided that nothing could surprise her anymore. She looked at me like I'd just told her I didn't like gluten, or that I was vegan, or some other inconvenient but ultimately manageable dietary restriction.
"Then you're in for a surprise," she said. And there was something in her voice, maybe pity, maybe amusement, maybe just exhaustion, that made my stomach drop even further than it already had. She handed me a visitor's pass that was printed on the cheapest sticker paper known to man, the kind that would leave residue on my shirt for weeks. "4th floor, ICU, room 427. Just follow the blue line on the floor." She pointed at a strip of blue tape that wound through the hospital like some kind of depressing yellow brick road. Except instead of leading to a wizard, it led to my personal nightmare. And boy, was I in for a surprise. Because surprises aren't just birthday parties and unexpected pizza deliveries. Sometimes, surprises are like landmines disguised as daily activities, just waiting for you to step wrong.
I followed that blue line like it was my death march, passing doctors who looked like they hadn't slept since medical school, nurses doing their best to keep people alive despite the system working against them, and visitors who all had that same glazed look that said they'd been sitting in waiting rooms so long they'd forgotten what natural sunlight looked like. The elevator to the 4th floor smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams. I shared it with an elderly woman who was clutching a teddy bear and softly crying, which felt like an omen, but I was already committed to this disaster. The doors opened with a ding that sounded like the universe laughing, and I stepped out into the ICU floor where everything was beeping and humming and generally giving off the vibe that people came here to either get better or give up entirely. Room 427 was at the end of a hallway that felt twice as long as it actually was. Each step felt like wading through concrete, my shoes squeaking on linoleum floors that had been waxed so many times they were practically mirrors. I could see my reflection in them. A guy who looked like he'd aged 15 years in the last hour, wearing a wrinkled shirt and an expression that screamed, "I've made a huge mistake." When I got to the window, that big glass panel that lets you peer into ICU rooms like you're at an aquarium, except instead of fish, it's people clinging to life, I stopped, my hand pressed against the glass, leaving a sweaty palm print that some janitor would curse me for later. And there she was. Through that window, lying in a hospital bed, surrounded by more machines than a Radio Shack going out of business sale, was Sarah. Not someone who looked like Sarah, not a Sarah-adjacent person, Sarah. Same face that I'd memorized during 3 years of marriage and 5 years of grief. Same high cheekbones that she'd always said made her look sophisticated, but I'd always thought made her look like trouble, which she was. Same small nose that she'd hated, but I'd loved. Same lips that used to smile at my terrible jokes and tell me I was an idiot in the most affectionate way possible. And there it was. Same mole under her left eye. That tiny beauty mark, barely visible unless you were close enough to count her freckles, which I had been many times. It was her signature, her identifier, the thing that made her face hers and not anyone else's. I used to kiss that mole every morning before work. This stupid ritual we'd started on our honeymoon and never stopped. She'd always laugh and push me away, but I knew she loved it. That mole was proof. Undeniable, unmistakable proof. The same woman who died 5 years ago was lying in that bed, pale and unconscious, but real, breathing with the help of machines that beeped in rhythm like a heartbeat. Her chest rose and fell slowly, mechanically, and I could see an IV line running into her arm, monitors tracking vitals that shouldn't exist. Her hair was different, shorter, darker, like she'd been trying to become someone else. But it was her. Her face, her hands, her everything. She looked thinner than I remembered, like life had been rough on her, which raised about 1,000,000 questions I wasn't ready to answer. Either I was hallucinating, and if I was, props to my brain for the attention to detail, really committing to the bit, or heaven had a return policy that nobody had bothered to mention in Sunday school. Maybe there was a celestial customer service department where dead people could file complaints. Yes, hello, I'd like to return this afterlife. It's not quite what I expected. The reviews were misleading. Maybe Sarah had found the receipt and demanded to speak to God's manager. Maybe I was having a stroke, and this was just my brain's final, elaborate prank before shutting down permanently. A doctor appeared next to me, materializing like doctors do when you're having a moment. He was tall, probably 6'2", with silver hair that looked professionally styled, in a white coat so pristine it could have been in a detergent commercial. His face had that generic doctor look, concerned but detached, professional but not quite human, like he'd practiced his bedside manner in front of a mirror until he got it just right. His name tag said Dr. Miller, and he looked like the kind of guy who drove a Mercedes and had strong opinions about wine. "Mr. Evans?" he asked, even though he obviously knew who I was. Doctors love doing that, asking questions they already know the answers to. It's like a power move, establishing dominance through unnecessary confirmation. I nodded, not trusting my voice to work properly. My throat felt like I'd swallowed sand, and my brain was still trying to process the fact that my dead wife was 20 feet away, separated by glass and 5 years of grief that suddenly felt wasted.
I'm Dr. Miller, head of the ICU unit. We need to talk. He gestured toward a small consultation room nearby, one of those awful spaces with uncomfortable chairs and a box of tissues on the table because they knew whatever got discussed in there would probably require crying. The walls were that depressing beige color that institutions love, and there was a poster about hand washing that looked like it had been there since the 90s. I followed him in, my legs moving on autopilot while my brain lagged behind, still stuck at that window, still staring at a woman who shouldn't exist. We sat down, him on one side of a table that had seen too many difficult conversations, me on the other, feeling like I was about to get fired from life itself. She was admitted under your name, he began, folding his hands on the table in that way doctors do when they're about to deliver news that's going to ruin your month. Laura Evans, delivered via emergency C-section 3 hours ago. Baby girl, 6 pounds, 4 ounces. Healthy, despite the circumstances. Mother coded twice during delivery, but we got her back. She's stable now, but critical. No ID when she came in, just a hospital band from a previous admission we can't track down, and your name listed as next of kin. I let that sink in, which was like trying to absorb an ocean with a paper towel. Laura Evans, not Sarah, Laura. Someone had given my dead wife a new name, a new identity, a whole new existence, and then that someone had put my name down as family, dragging me into whatever soap opera nightmare this was turning out to be. Doctor, I said, leaning forward in my chair until it creaked in protest, probably because even the furniture could sense this conversation was about to go sideways. Are you sure she didn't crawl out of a crypt first? Because I'm trying to figure out if I need a lawyer or a priest, and honestly, I'm leaning toward both. My voice came out sharper than I intended, but can you blame me? The man was sitting there all calm and collected like he hadn't just told me my dead wife had delivered a baby under a fake name while I was drinking garbage coffee at work. Dr. Miller didn't even blink. I'll give him credit. The man had the emotional range of a textbook, which I guess is what happens when you spend your entire career delivering bad news to people in consultation rooms that smell like sanitizer and despair. He just looked at me with those steady, professional eyes that had probably seen every reaction known to humanity and filed them all under expected responses to trauma. Sir, I understand this is difficult, he said, which was the understatement of the century. Difficult is parallel parking. Difficult is assembling IKEA furniture. This was a full-blown existential crisis wrapped in a medical mystery with a side of supernatural implications. But right now, we need next-of-kin authorization for continued care and decision-making purposes. There are forms to sign, insurance information to verify. Oh, great, I interrupted, throwing my hands up in a gesture that probably looked unhinged but felt completely justified. I get paperwork from the afterlife. That's fantastic. Really, what's next? Am I going to have to file a tax return for a ghost? Do I need to report resurrection as income? I was spiraling. I knew I was spiraling, but the alternative was accepting that this was really happening, and my brain wasn't ready for that level of reality. He slid a clipboard across the table, one of those industrial-strength hospital clipboards that probably cost $40 and could double as a weapon. It was loaded with forms, consent forms, privacy forms, financial responsibility forms, forms about forms. The American healthcare system in all its bureaucratic glory, now demanding I sign my name in triplicate to acknowledge that my supposedly dead wife had given birth. We need someone to make medical decisions if her condition deteriorates. Since you're listed as her emergency contact, I'm her what now?
I grabbed the clipboard, scanning the paperwork with the kind of manic energy that comes from pure confusion mixed with rage. And there it was, printed in that terrible hospital font that looks like it was designed to cause headaches. Emergency contact, David Evans. My name, my phone number, my address from 5 years ago, before I moved to a smaller apartment, because living in our old place felt like haunting my own life. Dr. Miller continued in that measured voice, probably the same tone he used to explain terminal diagnoses and experimental treatments. The patient was brought in by ambulance approximately 4 hours ago, in active labor and unresponsive. No identification, no insurance cards, nothing. Just that hospital band and the intake form from what appears to be prenatal visits we have no record of. We tried the emergency contact number, which led us to you. And nobody thought this was weird? I asked, looking up from the forms that might as well have been written in ancient Greek for all the sense they made to my overloaded brain. Nobody stopped and said, "Hey, maybe we should investigate why this woman has no ID, no history, and an emergency contact who thinks she's been dead for half a decade?" Sir, our priority is patient care, not detective work. That's for administration and possibly law enforcement to sort out. He stood up, signaling that this conversation was wrapping up, whether I was ready or not. But right now, she needs someone to authorize treatment, and legally, you're it. I'll give you some time to process, but we need those signatures today.
Then he did something that almost made me respect him. He paused at the door, and his professional mask slipped just a fraction. For what it's worth, Mr. Evans, in 20 years of medicine, I've never seen anything quite like this. I don't know what's going on here, but that woman in there fought hard to survive delivery. Whatever her story is, she wanted to live. He left, closing the door with a soft click that sounded way too final. I sat there alone with my thoughts and a clipboard full of paperwork that would determine the fate of a woman who was either my wife, a doppelganger, or proof that I'd finally snapped. The consultation room felt smaller suddenly, the walls closing in with their depressing beige paint and motivational posters about washing hands and staying positive. How was I supposed to stay positive about this? Through the small window in the door, I could see nurses rushing past, visitors looking lost, the whole organized chaos of a hospital operating exactly as designed. Normal people dealing with normal medical emergencies, broken bones, infections, scheduled surgeries. Meanwhile, I was sitting in a room trying to figure out if I should sign forms for a woman who died in my arms 5 years ago, who I'd buried, mourned, and somehow never managed to fully move on from. I looked at the forms again. They wanted me to make decisions about her care, to be responsible for medical choices that could mean life or death. Me, the guy who couldn't decide what to have for lunch without having an anxiety attack? The same guy who still had her toothbrush in the bathroom because throwing it away felt too permanent. They wanted me to be an adult, to handle this situation with grace and maturity. "Either I'm having the world's most elaborate hallucination," I said to the empty room, "or someone out there faked my wife's death and is about to get the kind of visit that makes people rethink their life choices. Possibly both." I grabbed the pen attached to the clipboard, one of those cheap ones on a metal chain, like hospitals think people are trying to steal their terrible pens, and started signing. Because what else was I going to do? Walk away? Let her die a second time? Yeah, right, like I could live with that. While the nurse tried to reach the listed emergency contact, because apparently I wasn't the only person in this nightmare scenario, I watched her dial a number from the intake paperwork with fingers that moved too fast for someone dealing with what should have been a routine call. Her name was Sandra, according to her badge, and she had the look of someone who'd worked double shifts for so long she'd forgotten what her own bed looked like. She punched in the numbers, held the phone to her ear, and waited, while I stood there like an idiot, eavesdropping on what was about to become the second most uncomfortable phone call of the day. She read the name aloud from the form, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of beeping monitors and distant intercoms paging doctors to various emergencies. Emergency contact, Daniel Price.
The moment those two words left her mouth, my stomach twisted into a knot so tight it could have been used for rock climbing. Daniel. Daniel freaking Price. That name hit me like a freight train loaded with betrayal and bad memories. The same Daniel Price who'd been my college roommate, my best man at my wedding? The guy who'd helped me move into my first apartment and stayed up all night assembling furniture while we argued about sports and drank cheap beer. The same Daniel who'd mysteriously vanished from my life right around the time Sarah died. Like a ghost who'd realized he'd overstayed his welcome at the haunting. I remembered the last time I'd seen him, at Sarah's funeral, actually, which now felt sickeningly ironic. He'd stood in the back wearing a black suit that looked too expensive for someone who claimed he was between jobs. He'd shaken my hand, mumbled some generic condolence about how sorry he was, and then disappeared before the reception. I tried calling him a few weeks later, needing a friend, needing someone who knew Sarah and could help me process the loss. His number was disconnected. His apartment was empty. His social media went dark. He'd vanished like he'd never existed at all. And at the time, I'd been too destroyed by grief to wonder why. "Ugh, perfect. Just perfect," I muttered. My ghost wife has ghost connections. This was turning into some kind of paranormal soap opera, the kind where everyone's connected in ways that make you want to throw your TV out the window. What was next? Was my mailman secretly my long-lost brother? Was my dentist actually a time traveler? At this point, nothing would surprise me. Sandra held the phone away from her ear slightly, and I could hear it. Once, twice, 3 times. Pick up, you coward, I thought. Pick up and explain why your name is on my dead wife's emergency contact list. On the 4th ring, someone answered, and I watched Sandra's face shift from professional neutral to slightly confused. "Hello, this is Northwestern Medical Center calling for Daniel Price," she said in that practiced hospital voice that somehow managed to sound both urgent and casual. "We have a patient here, Laura Evans, who listed you as an emergency contact. She's just given birth." A man's voice on the other end, muffled but audible enough that I could hear the confusion even from where I stood. "Laura Evans? Are you sure?" He sounded genuinely bewildered, like he'd been asked about someone he'd never heard of, which only made this whole situation more infuriating. Either he was a fantastic liar, or he was just as confused as the rest of us, and I wasn't sure which option made me angrier. "Yeah, buddy, we're sure, super sure, absolutely certain that your name is written right here next to a woman who looks exactly like my supposedly dead wife, but is apparently going by a name that sounds like she picked it out of a witness protection handbook. I'm sure about all of it, except the part where any of this makes sense." Sandra continued, reading from her script like she'd done this 1,000 times, which she probably had. "Yes, sir. Laura Evans. You're listed as her emergency contact. She's in critical condition following delivery, and we need someone to come down and provide information if possible. Are you able to come to the hospital?" There was a pause on the other end, the kind of pause that speaks volumes. I could practically hear him thinking, calculating, trying to figure out what to say. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed, less confused, more resigned, like he'd just remembered something he'd been trying to forget. "I'll be there right away," he said. And those 5 words felt like a confession. "Of course you will," I muttered under my breath, just loud enough for Sandra to glance at me with concern. Because apparently, betrayal has excellent GPS, probably uses Waze to avoid traffic and moral accountability. I could already picture him in his car, probably something ridiculous like a Lexus or a BMW, definitely something with heated seats and a sound system that cost more than my monthly rent, navigating through the same Chicago traffic I'd just survived, coming to the hospital like he had any right to be here. Sandra hung up and looked at me with an expression that was part sympathy, part "this is above my pay grade." She probably dealt with family drama all the time. Divorced parents fighting over custody, siblings arguing about pulling plugs, relatives crawling out of the woodwork when someone's dying with money. But this had to be a new one even for her. "He said he'll be here within the hour," she informed me, making a note on her paperwork. "Do you know Mr. Price, sir?" "Yeah," I said, my voice coming out bitter and sharp, like coffee that's been sitting on the burner too long. "Yeah, I know him. Or, at least, I thought I did. Turns out, I don't know much of anything anymore." I looked back toward the ICU room, where Sarah, or Laura, or whoever she was pretending to be, lay unconscious, connected to machines that were keeping her alive, while the truth stayed buried under layers of lies and fake names. Sandra nodded like she understood, even though she absolutely didn't and couldn't. "I'll let you know when he arrives," she said, already turning back to her computer, because hospitals don't stop running just because your life is falling apart. There were other patients, other emergencies, other families having their own personal catastrophes in consultation rooms up and down this floor. I walked back to that window, pressed my forehead against the cool glass, and stared at the woman who'd apparently decided that faking her death and living a secret life was preferable to whatever we'd had together. The machines beeped their steady rhythm, indifferent to the chaos swirling around them. Somewhere in this building, Daniel Price was on his way, probably rehearsing whatever story he'd concocted to explain why his name was tangled up in this mess. 5 years, I whispered to the glass, my breath fogging it up. 5 years I thought you were gone. And all this time? I couldn't finish the sentence because I didn't know how it ended. All this time? What? She'd been alive? She'd been with him? She'd been running? She'd been planning to come back? The only thing I knew for certain was that when Daniel walked through those doors, he and I were going to have a conversation that was 5 years overdue. And it wasn't going to be pretty. When Daniel walked in, he looked like life had been kind to him. Too kind. The kind of kind that makes you want to punch kindness right in its smug face. He was wearing a tailored suit that probably cost more than my car. Charcoal gray with subtle pinstripes that screamed, "I make 6 figures and have a financial advisor." The fabric looked expensive, the kind that doesn't wrinkle even when you've been sitting in traffic for an hour contemplating your crimes. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, probably Italian leather, definitely something with a designer name I couldn't pronounce. And there it was, gleaming on his wrist like a tiny beacon of douchebaggery. A Rolex. An actual, genuine Rolex. The kind that costs as much as a year's rent and tells you the time in 3 time zones you'll never visit. His hair was perfectly styled, that calculated, messy look that requires $40 worth of product and a YouTube tutorial. He had a slight tan, like he'd just gotten back from somewhere tropical where people drink cocktails with umbrellas and don't think about their dead wives coming back to life. He looked healthy, successful, like a guy who'd made all the right choices and slept soundly at night on Egyptian cotton sheets with a thread count that had more zeros than my bank account. Meanwhile, I looked like I'd been dragged behind a bus through a car wash, wearing yesterday's shirt and the emotional stability of a Jenga tower in an earthquake. The contrast was almost funny. Almost. His face had that look people get when they're trying to seem concerned, but are actually just calculating their exit strategy. You know that expression, the slightly furrowed brow, the downturned mouth, the eyes that are looking at you but also past you, already planning their next move. It was the face of a man who'd walked into a situation he'd hoped to avoid, and was now stuck in it like quicksand in an expensive suit. We locked eyes across the ICU waiting area, and for a second, the whole world seemed to hold its breath. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere, a monitor beeped. An orderly pushed a cart past us, wheels squeaking on linoleum. But between us, there was just silence. The kind of silence that happens right before someone throws a punch or says something that can never be unsaid. Even the beeping machines seemed to pause, like they were waiting to see what would happen when two guys with a shared history of lies met in a hospital hallway. "Long time," he said, casually, like we just bumped into each other at a coffee shop instead of a hospital where my supposedly dead wife had just given birth. His voice was smooth, practiced, the voice of someone who'd gotten very good at lying. He even managed a smile conically, which took some serious audacity. I had to give him credit. The man had balls. Terrible, traitorous balls, but balls nonetheless. "Yeah," I replied, and I could hear the edge in my own voice, sharp enough to cut through his expensive suit and whatever excuses he'd prepared on the drive over. "About 5 years. Same timeline as my wife's funeral. Small world, huh?" I emphasized funeral just to watch him flinch, which he did, just slightly. A tiny crack in that professional facade. A flicker of something that might have been guilt or might have just been indigestion. His jaw tightened, and he had the nerve to look concerned, like he actually cared, like he hadn't disappeared from my life at the exact moment I'd needed friends the most. "David, I didn't know," he started, and his voice had that apologetic tone that people use when they're about to deliver a rehearsed explanation that explains nothing. "Save it," I cut him off, taking a step closer. I wasn't normally a confrontational guy. I was more of a write angry emails and delete them kind of person. But something about seeing him here, now, looking so put together while my life was falling apart for the second time, flipped a switch I didn't know I had. Either you two faked her death, or I'm living in a bad Netflix series, and honestly, I'm not sure which option makes me want to hit you more.
A nurse, different from Sandra, this one younger with glasses, and an expression that said she'd seen too many Jerry Springer episodes play out in this hallway, awkwardly cleared her throat. She'd been standing nearby, probably documenting something on her tablet, and had gotten caught in our moment of tension. "Gentlemen, please," she said, her voice firm but nervous, like a substitute teacher trying to control a classroom. "Not near the patient. We have conference rooms if you need to discuss things." I smiled tightly, the kind of smile that doesn't reach your eyes because your eyes are busy calculating whether hospital security would stop you from committing justifiable homicide. "Don't worry. I'll wait until she wakes up before the yelling starts. I'm classy like that." I looked back at Daniel, who had the decency to look uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one expensive shoe to the other. "We've got time, right, Daniel? Since, apparently, we've got 5 years' worth of catching up to do." He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it up in a way that probably still looked intentional. "Can we talk somewhere private?" he asked, glancing around at the nurses, visitors, and other people who were definitely eavesdropping because hospital drama is free entertainment and better than whatever's on the waiting room TV. "Oh, now you want privacy?" I laughed, but it came out bitter and sharp. "That's rich. Where was this desire for privacy 5 years ago when you were apparently helping my wife fake her death? Did you guys have a private conversation about that? Maybe over dinner, coffee, or were you too busy planning whatever the hell this is?" I gestured toward the ICU room where Sarah/Laura lay unconscious. "It's not what you think," Daniel said, which is what everyone says when it's exactly what you think. It's the universal phrase for, "It's worse than you think, but I'm going to try to spin it anyway." "Really?" I crossed my arms, a defensive posture I'd picked up from years of feeling defensive. "Because what I think is that my wife, who I watched them lower into the ground, who I mourned for 5 years, who I still can't look at pictures of without wanting to cry, is somehow alive and just gave birth, and your name is on her emergency contact list? So, please, enlighten me. Tell me what I'm not understanding about this totally normal, not at all insane situation." He looked at the floor, at the walls,
anywhere but at me. When people can't make eye contact, it's usually because they know they're wrong, and they're hoping if they avoid looking at you, the wrongness will somehow hurt less. It doesn't work that way.
"She made me promise not to tell you," he finally said, his voice quiet, almost pleading. "She said it was the only way to keep you safe." Safe? The word came out louder than I intended, and several people in the waiting area looked over. I didn't care. Safe from what? Happiness? A normal life? Knowing my wife wasn't dead? Yeah, real safe, Daniel. I feel super protected. Thanks for that. A security guard started walking in our direction, a big guy with a bored expression that said he'd broken up plenty of fights in this hospital, and ours would just be another Tuesday. The nurse with glasses waved him off, mouthing, "It's okay," which was generous of her because it absolutely was not okay. Daniel looked like he wanted to disappear, and good. He should feel that way. He should feel uncomfortable and trapped and like the walls were closing in, because that's how I'd felt every single day for 5 years. "There's a conference room on the 3rd floor," he said quietly. "Let me explain everything. You deserve that much." "I deserve a lot more than that," I shot back. "But sure, let's start with an explanation and work our way up to the part where I decide whether to forgive you or ruin your life. Should be fun." The next morning, she opened her eyes. My heart nearly exploded. And I don't mean that in a romantic movie kind of way. I mean it in an I might actually be having a cardiac event and need the crash cart kind of way. I'd spent the entire night in that horrible plastic chair next to her bed, the kind designed by someone who clearly hated the concept of human comfort. My back felt like it had been through a medieval torture device. My neck was stuck at an angle that definitely wasn't natural, and I'd consumed enough hospital coffee from the vending machine to power a small city. The stuff tasted like battery acid mixed with disappointment, but it kept me awake through the longest night of my life. Watching her breathe, watching the monitors, waiting for something, anything, to make sense. Daniel had tried to explain things in that conference room last night. Something about witness protection that wasn't actually witness protection, about dangerous people, about debts and threats, and reasons why faking her death was somehow the noble choice. But his explanations had been vague, full of holes you could drive a truck through, and he'd spent more time checking his phone than making eye contact. I'd left that conversation with more questions than answers and a burning desire to punch something, preferably his face. But now, watching her eyelids flutter open for the first time in what felt like forever, all that anger took a backseat to something else. Hope, maybe? Or just desperate curiosity. Her eyes moved slowly, adjusting to the harsh hospital lights that made everything look washed out and clinical. She blinked several times, confused, disoriented, like someone waking up from a dream they couldn't quite remember. The monitors around her started beeping faster as her heart rate picked up, and a nurse I hadn't seen before poked her head in, checked the machines, and gave me a nod before disappearing back into the hallway. "Sarah?" I whispered, leaning forward in my chair, which creaked loudly in protest because even the furniture in this place was dramatic. My voice came out rough, scratchy from too much coffee and not enough sleep. I was gripping the bed rail so hard, my knuckles had turned white, like if I held on tight enough, this moment would stay real and not dissolve into another nightmare. Her lips moved weakly, barely more than a whisper, and I had to lean in closer to hear what she was saying. The smell of hospital antiseptic mixed with whatever soap they'd used to clean her up before surgery filled my nostrils. Her voice, when it finally came out, was hoarse and broken and barely audible over the beeping machines. "Daniel?" I swear I felt my soul leave my body, pack a suitcase, and order an Uber to literally anywhere else. My heart, which had been doing gymnastics just seconds ago, plummeted straight through the floor and possibly into the basement. The room suddenly felt too small, too hot,
like all the oxygen had been sucked out and replaced with pure, concentrated betrayal. The beeping monitors sounded accusing, like even the machines were judging me for being stupid enough to hope. "Ugh, sure," I muttered, sitting back in my chair hard enough that it nearly tipped over. My voice was thick with sarcasm and something that felt dangerously close to tears, which I absolutely refused to acknowledge. I ran my hands through my hair, which probably looked like a bird's nest at this point. This is perfect. This is just perfect. She blinked again, turning her head slowly toward my voice, and I watched confusion wash over her face. Her eyes, those same eyes I'd stared into 1,000 times, that I'd memorized during late-night conversations and lazy Sunday mornings, were filled with tears that started streaming down her pale cheeks, leaving tracks through what little remained of her composure.
"I can explain," she said weakly, and her voice broke on the last word. "Please do," I said, spreading my arms wide in a gesture that encompassed the entire absurd situation. The hospital room, the machines, the 5 years of lies, all of it. Because this feels like a group project where I didn't even know I was enrolled, and somehow I'm still getting graded on it. By all means, explain how you died, came back, had a baby, and your first word upon waking up is someone else's name. I'm all ears. Really, I've got nowhere else to be. And apparently, my life is a joke anyway, so let's hear the punchline. She closed her eyes again, tears still flowing, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths that the monitors tracked with their steady beeping. When she opened them again, there was something in her expression that I'd never seen before. Fear, maybe? Or regret so deep it had its own gravitational pull. "My name is Laura now," she said, each word seeming to cost her energy she didn't have. "Laura Evans. New ID, new city, new life. I had to disappear." "You had to make me think that you were dead," I finished for her, my voice sharp. "Yeah, mission accomplished on that one. Gold star. Really stellar work. The funeral was lovely, by the way. You would have been proud. Great turnout. Terrible casseroles. And I only cried in front of people like 50 times. But sure, let's talk about your new life." "David, please," she pleaded. And hearing my name and her voice after 5 years of silence hit different than I expected. I wasn't running from you. That stopped me cold. I leaned forward again, searching her face for the lie, for the angle, for whatever con this was. "Who were you were running from?" I asked quietly, and suddenly the anger gave way to something else. Actual concern, curiosity, maybe even the tiniest shred of understanding, trying to elbow its way past my wall of resentment. She opened her mouth to answer, but then her eyes darted toward the door, and her whole body tensed up in a way that made every monitor in the room go crazy. A nurse rushed in, checking her vitals, adjusting something on the IV line, asking if she was in pain. The moment was broken, shattered like glass, and whatever she'd been about to tell me was swallowed by the chaos of medical intervention. But in that split second before the nurse arrived, I'd seen something in her eyes that changed everything. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't shame. It was terror. Pure, primal terror. The kind that comes from real danger, not from being caught in a lie. Whatever she'd been running from, whoever she'd been hiding from, it wasn't a joke. It wasn't a scam. It was real. And it was bad enough that she'd let me believe she was dead for 5 years just to keep it away from me. Turns out her name was Laura now. New ID, new city, new life. She'd faked her death to escape me. Or so she thought. But here's the real twist. The one that Daniel had been dancing around all night in that conference room with his vague explanations and his guilty face. She wasn't running from me. She was running from someone else. Someone bad enough that disappearing was the only option. Someone dangerous enough that involving me would have gotten me killed. And judging by the fear in her eyes and the way she kept glancing at that door like she expected someone to walk through it at any moment, whoever she was running from might not be done chasing her.
"We need to talk," I said to her quietly while the nurse fussed with machines and pretended not to eavesdrop. "When you're ready, when you're strong enough, we need to talk about everything. About why you ran, about who you're afraid of, about that baby in the nursery who doesn't have any idea what kind of mess she's been born into. But mostly," I paused, making sure she was looking at me, really looking at me. "Mostly, we need to talk about what happens next. Because Laura, or Sarah, or whoever you are now, this doesn't end here." She told me everything, in broken sentences, between tears and exhaustion, her voice fading in and out like a radio station with bad reception. The nurse had finally left us alone after extracting a promise that I wouldn't upset her further, which was rich considering my entire existence had been upset for 5 years straight. The monitors continued their steady beeping, a soundtrack to the worst story I'd ever heard. And trust me, I'd sat through my cousin's 3-hour presentation about his cryptocurrency investments, so that was saying something. After the crash, and it really had been a crash, she assured me, like that somehow made it better. Someone had pulled her from the wreckage before emergency services arrived. Not a good Samaritan, not a passerby with a hero complex. Someone who'd been waiting, watching, expecting her to be there. The car accident hadn't been an accident at all. It had been a message, a warning, a threat from people she'd inadvertently crossed paths with through her job at the accounting firm. She'd seen something she wasn't supposed to see, stumbled across numbers that didn't add up, transactions that led to very bad people doing very bad things. Daniel had been there that night. Pure coincidence, or so he claimed. Wrong place, right time, depending on how you looked at it. He'd helped her vanish, gave her a new name, new documents, promised her protection.
"He saved my life," she whispered. And I wanted to point out that he'd also ruined mine. But I kept my mouth shut because she was crying and hooked up to machines, and I wasn't that much of a monster yet. Except Daniel wasn't a savior, not even close. He was a scammer with a side hustle in human misery. He'd used her new identity as cover for money laundering through fake medical research foundations, charity organizations that existed only on paper and in bank accounts in countries that didn't ask too many questions. She'd been his shield, his alibi, his, "See, there's a real person behind this totally legitimate stamp of approval." And she'd gone along with it, because what choice did she have? The people she was running from were still out there, still looking, and Daniel was the only thing standing between her and whatever fate they had planned. "So, he's the father?" I asked, and my voice came out flat, dead, like I'd used up all my emotional range and was running on empty. The baby. The whole reason we were here. 6 pounds, 4 ounces of innocent life caught in the middle of this absolute dumpster fire. "Biologically, yes," she said weakly, not meeting my eyes. She stared at the ceiling tiles, counting them maybe, or praying to them, or just avoiding looking at the disappointment on my face. It wasn't supposed to happen. When I got pregnant, he panicked, said it was too complicated, too risky. He disappeared 6 months ago. Changed his number, moved addresses, left me with nothing but a fake ID and medical bills I couldn't pay under a name that wasn't real. I sighed, a deep, exhausted sound that came from somewhere in my bones. Of course, I get all the drama, none of the child tax credits. The joke fell flat because nothing was funny anymore. Nothing had been funny for a very long time. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw someone I didn't recognize. This wasn't the Sarah who'd laughed at my terrible puns and burned breakfast every Sunday. This was Laura, whoever that was. A stranger wearing my wife's face and carrying 5 years of secrets that had aged her in ways that time alone couldn't explain. But something shifted inside me right then. Something fundamental that I hadn't felt since the funeral. She wasn't the villain of my story anymore. She'd never been, actually. She was a survivor in someone else's mess.
collateral damage in a war she hadn't signed up for. The real villain was somewhere out there. Maybe multiple villains, actually, considering how complicated this was getting. And they'd stolen 5 years from both of us in different ways. And the man who'd caused it, the one who'd played hero while secretly playing everyone else, Daniel Price, with his expensive suit and his Rolex and his carefully constructed lies. Oh, I was going to redecorate his life with regret. I was going to make him wish he'd stayed disappeared.
Because if there's one thing I'd learned in 5 years of grief-induced therapy and self-help books I pretended to read, it's that some people deserve to face consequences for their actions. And Daniel was about to get a masterclass in accountability, taught by a guy who had nothing left to lose and a suddenly very creative understanding of revenge. "Rest," I told her, standing up from that horrible chair that had become my temporary home. "Get your strength back, because when you're ready, we're going to figure this out. We're going to protect that baby, fix this mess, and make sure the people who did this pay for it. All of them." She looked at me with something like hope in her eyes, which was probably misplaced because I had no idea what I was doing. But fake it till you make it, right? That's what all the motivational posters said. Time to find out if confidence and spite were enough to take down a criminal conspiracy. Spoiler alert, they weren't, but I was going to try anyway. Daniel tried to vanish, but I wasn't the same grieving fool he remembered. 5 years changes a person, and not always in the "I found myself through yoga and meditation" kind of way. Sometimes it changes you in the "I'm petty enough to spend weeks planning revenge and resourceful enough to actually pull it off" kind of way. I was 5 years smarter, 10 times angrier, and approximately infinity% more willing to burn bridges. I'd already watched someone I love blow up. He'd slipped out of the hospital that first night while I was still processing Laura's confession, probably thinking he could ghost his way out of this situation like he'd ghosted his way out of my life 5 years ago. Classic Daniel move. When things get complicated, disappear and let other people clean up the mess. But this time, I wasn't about to let him walk away without consequences. This time, I had something he didn't know about: motivation, free time, and a truly unhealthy amount of anger that needed a productive outlet. I had contacts. In cybersecurity, specifically my college buddy Derek, who worked for one of those firms that companies hire when they've been hacked and need someone to figure out where their data went. Derek owed me a favor from when I'd helped him move apartments and didn't judge him for his collection of vintage action figures still in their original packaging. And my cousin worked for the IRS, which sounds boring until you realize that the IRS is basically the most powerful organization in America, and they don't need warrants to ruin your entire financial existence. Janet had always been the overachiever of the family, and she took her job very, very seriously. Like I reported my own grandmother for unreported garage sale income seriously. One phone call to Derek, another to Janet, and I had set in motion a chain of events that would make Daniel's life implode in the most beautifully bureaucratic way possible. Derek started digging into Daniel's digital footprint. Bank accounts, shell companies, those fake medical research foundations Laura had mentioned. Turns out, when you're laundering money through charitable organizations, you leave a paper trail wider than the Grand Canyon. And Derek found it in about 48 hours. He sent me a file so thick with evidence it could have been used as a doorstop. Janet, bless her rule-following heart, took that information and ran with it like it was the Olympics of tax fraud investigation. Within a week, Daniel's accounts froze. All of them. Checking, savings, those offshore accounts he thought were untraceable because he'd set them up through some shady lawyer in the Caymans. Frozen solid, like a popsicle in a deep freeze, and just as useful. His fancy condo in Lincoln Park, the one with the rooftop terrace and the marble countertops and the monthly HOA fees that cost more than my rent, got seized.
Federal agents showed up with paperwork and zero sympathy, probably wondering why this guy had an apartment worth $1 million while claiming $30,000 a year in income. Math didn't math, as the kids say. His Porsche. Oh, that beautiful silver Porsche 911 that he'd posted on Instagram approximately 700 times with captions about hard work paying off and living the dream. Towed by a guy named Ron, who I tipped an extra $50 to laugh while doing it. Ron was a professional. He gave it his best villain cackle, really committed to the bit, and even threw in a "should have paid your taxes, buddy," for good measure. I watched from across the street, eating a hot dog from a street vendor, and it was the most satisfying lunch I'd had in years. When Daniel finally realized what was happening, when his card started declining and his landlord called about the seizure notice and his car was gone, he called me. Of course he did. His number showed up on my phone, and I let it ring 3 times before answering, just to make him sweat a little. When I picked up, I could hear the rage and panic in his voice before he even spoke. "What did you do?" he screamed, and I had to hold the phone away from my ear because he was practically vibrating with fury. "My accounts are frozen. They took my car. They're saying I'm under investigation for fraud and money laundering. This is insane. You can't." "You faked my wife's death, Daniel," I interrupted, my voice calm and cold and absolutely done with his nonsense. I was sitting in my apartment, feet up on my coffee table, drinking the fancy beer I'd bought to celebrate this exact moment. I faked your financial future. Fair trade, if you ask me. Actually, I think I'm being pretty generous. I could have done a lot worse. "This is illegal. I'll sue you. "With what money?" I asked pleasantly. "Your frozen accounts? Your seized assets? Go ahead, hire a lawyer." "Oh, wait, lawyers cost money. Funny how that works." I took a sip of my beer, savoring both the taste and the sound of his world crumbling through the phone.
Here's what's going to happen, Daniel. You're going to cooperate with the federal investigation. You're going to tell them everything about those foundations, those transactions, all of it. And then you're going to leave Laura alone, forever. You don't call, you don't text, you don't even think about her or that baby. Clear? Silence on the other end, except for his heavy breathing and what might have been the sound of him punching a wall. Finally, "You have no idea what you've done." "Oh, I know exactly what I've done," I said. "I've made sure you can't hurt anyone else. Consider it a public service." Then I hung up, blocked his number, and finished my beer. Honestly, it felt better than therapy. Way cheaper, too. The baby? Little Emma. Yeah, I renamed her. To spite my own rule about getting involved, because apparently spite was my primary love language now. Had her mother's eyes, not Laura's eyes, Sarah's eyes. The ones I remembered from before everything went to hell. Before fake deaths and money laundering and hospital calls that shouldn't have been possible. When I first saw her in the nursery, wrapped in one of those hospital blankets that look like they're made from the world's scratchiest material, she was sleeping peacefully, completely unaware that she'd been born into a situation that would require years of therapy to unpack. The nurse, a kind older woman named Patricia, who reminded me of everyone's favorite grandmother, let me hold her even though I technically wasn't family, wasn't the father, wasn't anything official except a guy who'd signed a bunch of paperwork because the universe has a sick sense of humor. Emma weighed almost nothing, this tiny bundle of human potential who'd done absolutely nothing to deserve being born into this circus. When she opened her eyes and looked at me, really looked at me with that intense baby stare that seems to see straight through your soul, something shifted inside my chest that I wasn't prepared for. "Hey there, small person," I whispered, because talking in a normal voice to a baby felt wrong, like it would shatter something fragile. "Your family tree is a mess. Your dad's a criminal, and your mom faked her death for 5 years, but none of that's your fault. You're just here trying to figure out how fingers work and why adults are so weird. I respect that." She made a small noise, something between a grunt and a sigh, which I chose to interpret as agreement.
Laura, or Sarah, or whoever she'd become in the space between her old life and this new disaster, recovered slowly. The doctors said she was lucky to be alive, that delivering a baby while your body's shutting down from stress and malnutrition isn't exactly the recommended approach to motherhood. She'd been living rough for months, hiding from Daniel after he'd bailed, trying to figure out how to bring a baby into the world when you technically didn't exist according to any official records. No insurance, no support system, no backup plan except showing up at a hospital and hoping for the best. We didn't get back together. That needs to be clear, because this isn't one of those stories where love conquers all and everyone rides off into the sunset holding hands. Some stories don't need fairy tale endings wrapped up in neat bows with inspirational music playing in the background. Some stories just end with people being honest with each other for the first time in years, acknowledging that what they had is gone and can't be recovered. And that's okay. That's actually better than okay, because pretending would have been worse. She sat in her hospital bed one afternoon, about 2 weeks after Emma was born, and we had the conversation we should have had 5 years ago if she hadn't been too scared and I hadn't been too trusting. "I loved you," she said, "and the past tense hurt more than I expected. I loved our life, but I was never going to let those people hurt you because of something I saw. Letting you think I was dead was the only way to keep you safe and away from all of this." "You could have told me," I said, but even as the words came out, I knew they weren't entirely true. Would I have believed her? Would I have let her go? Would I have done something stupid and tried to play hero, getting myself killed in the process? Probably. "Okay," I said, "maybe you couldn't have told me. But Daniel was a mistake." She cut me off, her voice firm despite the exhaustion. "He seemed like the answer at first, like someone who could actually protect me. By the time I realized what he really was, I was in too deep. The pregnancy was an accident, and his true colors came out real fast when things got complicated." She looked at Emma, sleeping in the bassinet next to her bed. "But I can't regret her. She's the only good thing that came from any of this. We did something better than getting back together. Forgiveness. Real forgiveness. The kind that acknowledges hurt and anger and betrayal, but decides that carrying all that weight around isn't worth it anymore. I forgave her for the 5 years of grief, for the funeral where I'd cried so hard I couldn't breathe, for the nights I'd laid awake wondering if I could have saved her. She forgave me for being the kind of person she felt she had to protect by destroying, for not being someone she could trust with the truth, for whatever inadequacies in our relationship had made her think disappearing was the only option. It wasn't dramatic. There were no big speeches or romantic gestures. We just sat there in that hospital room with its beeping machines and terrible lighting, and we let go of the past. Not forgot it, you don't forget something like that, but released it, like opening your hand and watching something heavy finally roll away. I helped her move somewhere safe after she was discharged. A small apartment in a suburb 40 minutes outside the city where nobody knew her as Sarah or Laura, where she could just be a single mom trying to figure out life one day at a time. I paid off her hospital bills, which were astronomical because American healthcare is a scam designed to bankrupt people at their most vulnerable. My savings account took a serious hit. But money's just money, and it felt good to fix something concrete after months of dealing with problems that couldn't be solved with a checkbook. I set her up with a lawyer, a real one, not whatever shady character Daniel had connected her with, who specialized in identity issues and witness protection adjacent cases. Turns out there are legal ways to exist when you can't be who you used to be, paperwork that can make a new identity legitimate, processes for people who need to disappear for their own safety. It wasn't quick, and it wasn't cheap, but it was possible. She sent me pictures sometimes. Her and Emma, smiling, alive, existing in a world that had finally stopped trying to kill them. Emma in a onesie covered in dinosaurs. Emma discovering her own feet with the kind of wonder that adults forget how to feel. Emma covered in what I assumed was pureed carrots, looking proud of the mess. Normal baby stuff. Normal mom stuff. The kind of mundane happiness that people take for granted until they've lost it. I never visited. We both agreed it was better that way. Cleaner, safer, less complicated. She had her life, I had mine, and Emma would grow up with a mom who loved her and a complicated origin story that would probably come out during her rebellious teenage years and cause all sorts of drama. But that was future problems. Present problems were handled. The bad guys were facing consequences, and everyone involved was still breathing, which felt like a win given how this whole thing had started. And every now and then, when my phone rings from an unknown number, I still flinch. My heart does that thing where it jumps into my throat, and my brain immediately starts catastrophizing about what fresh hell is calling me now. Because once you get a call from your dead wife giving birth, once you've lived through the kind of Tuesday that rewrites your entire understanding of reality, spam calls just hit different. That little moment of panic before you answer, wondering if it's a telemarketer trying to sell you car insurance or if your life is about to explode again. It never fully goes away.
But most of the time, it's just spam. Just someone trying to reach me about my car's extended warranty, which is expired, and I don't care. Just a robocall about lowering my credit card interest rate on cards I don't have. Just normal, annoying, everyday intrusions that remind me my life has returned to being boring. And boring, it turns out, is exactly what I needed. Boring is underrated. Boring means nobody's faking their death. Nobody's laundering money through fake charities. Nobody's having secret babies in ICU units. Boring means I can drink my terrible office coffee without my phone ringing with life-altering news. Boring means I get to exist without constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering when the next disaster will hit. I still think about Sarah sometimes. Not the Laura version, but the original Sarah. The woman I married and loved and thought I'd lost forever. I think about the life we could have had if she'd seen different numbers in that accounting ledger, if she'd looked away instead of digging deeper, if she'd trusted me enough to let me help carry the weight. But those thoughts are gentler now, less like open wounds and more like old scars that ache when it rains. Emma will be okay. Laura will be okay too. And me, I'm okay too. In that relative way that people are okay after surviving something that should have broken them, but somehow didn't. I wake up, I go to work, I drink terrible coffee, and my phone stays mostly quiet. That's not a fairy tale ending, but it's an ending. And after everything that's happened, it's enough.